I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. This is Ken Gloss of Brattle Bookshop will be joining us here, doing a presentation on a first-hand look at secondhand books. I usually give a little bit of a background about the Old Bridgewater Historical Society, and since we're still kind of early, I'll go ahead and get started with that tonight and give everybody else a chance to log in over the next few minutes. My name is Shelley Carolchick. I'm the president of the Old Bridgewater Historical Society. The society was founded in 1894, so we've been around for a little while. Normally, we would be doing this wonderful lecture tonight at our brick and mortar location in West Bridgewater. Obviously, that's not as easy as it was a year ago, so we're doing a Zoom presentation. Our society has been closed to the public for quite a bit of the last 9 months, but we are still very active on social media, and we are still answering queries by both mail and email, and we are still, the volunteers are still meeting to do research and work on some of the activities. We've had some great stuff happen to us this year. We've gotten some grants. For those of you who are local to our community, you'll know that we've done a lot of work on the Keith House this year. We've gotten it painted, we've done repairs, we've got a new sign up. It's looking fantastic. If you haven't driven by it lately, I highly recommend it. For those of you who don't know where it is, it's on River Street in West Bridgewater, not very far from War Memorial Park. We normally do events every month, but we have been unable to do that. However, our quarterly newsletter is still chock full of great newsletter articles, and that goes out to our members every quarter. Those articles always pertain in some way to the 4 towns of Bridgewater. So that would be Bridgewater, East Bridgewater, West Bridgewater, and Brockton. We do the history of all 4, and our focus is colonial history. However, we do the history right up until the 20th century. Joining me tonight, I have Mary O'Connell, who is one of our directors with the Old Bridgewater Historical Society, and of course our esteemed speaker, Ken Gloss, owner and operator of the Brattle Bookshop and a book historian extraordinaire. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the lecture over to him so that he can educate and entertain us.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. What I'll do in the talk will last about 45 minutes or so, an hour. First half hour, I'll talk about what is an old book, what is a first edition. I'll show off some of the things that I have with me, give a little bit of my background history, and also tell some stories, anecdotes of people I've seen, books, places, and so on. And then what I like to do, that's about the first half hour. And then what I'll do for the next 15, 20 minutes is question and answer. And I can go on and on and on and on about old books, but at least with question and answer, I can go on about what you want to listen to. If in the question and answer, there are a few books that you want to praise, normally when I do live talks, there's whole lines and lots of them. It's a little harder on Zoom, but we can try a few. And if not, they can all get done after the fact with emails and phone calls and so on. In any case, when you talk about old books, probably the first thing that comes up is, what is an old book? And usually people mean by that, what's a valuable old book? Well, the first printed book was in 1456, the Gutenberg Bible. If any of you have a Gutenberg Bible, let me assure you that it's valuable. Matter of fact, the last time one sold, half of it sold for $5.5 million. Single pages sell between $50,000 and $100,000 on average, and some even more. So if you have a Gutenberg Bible. Now, a little aside, I don't usually talk about this, but since it's been in the news, and this will sound like I'm going off subject, but I was watching Jeopardy with Alex Trebek about 7 or 8 years ago. I like it, I enjoy it. And then a answer pops up. Ken Gloss, Antiques Roadshow appraiser, says this book is worth $25 million. And the answer was Gutenberg Bible. But I had no idea that that was going to be on. I remember someone calling, but they wouldn't say why. And I'm watching Jeopardy, and there I am. I actually have a little T-shirt with the question on it now. But a lot of people, when one of the things about books like that, anything on an old book, anything printed in the 1400s has value. Some more than others, but anything in the 1400s is valuable. After that, it depends on what the book is. You could have a book printed in the 1500s that was a relatively dull and uninteresting book then, and it's still a relatively dull and uninteresting book now, and nobody cares, won't pay anything much for it. On the other hand, you could have relatively recent books. The first edition of the first Harry Potter book in London, I mean, it's only a little over 20 years old, can sell upwards of $100,000. So it's all what people are looking for. And I get loads of calls. People say, I have an old book. I know it's an old book. And the way I know it's an old book is the pages are all brown and crumbling. Well, I point out that's more lousy paper than it is how old the book is. Now, this is a page that I'll show. It's a little harder to see here, but you'll see it's not terribly fragile. The paper's white, the ink's black. It's one of the first books done with illustrations. This page was printed in the 1490s. So it's a little over 500 years old. And you sort of say to yourself, well, gee, if they could make books like that then, why don't they do it now? Well, there's a big disadvantage to a book like that. First of all, in the 1490s, you were to be quite wealthy to get an education, to learn how to read. You had to be almost nobility to be able to afford to buy a book like that. Nowadays, maybe the books aren't quite as well made, but they're at a price that can be distributed in the millions. And the real value of books is the knowledge in the books and the dissemination of that knowledge. And I think it's a very good trade-off. Again, when you talk about books and book collecting, somebody will come up and always say, I have a first edition. How much is it worth? And I point out that most first editions never came out in a second edition, probably never should have come out in a first edition. Nobody cares about them, wants them, or would pay anything whatsoever. A book has to be historically, scientifically, literarily, or for some other reason important that there are a group of collectors out there who want it. And usually when you think of first editions, you think of literature. Dickens, Twain, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and so on. And even within that, there are a lot of things that make a big difference in the price. The condition being one of the most important. The paper dust jacket on a 20th century book can make all the difference in the world. My father had a copy of William Faulkner's second book called Mosquitoes. Absolutely pristine, as if someone took it from the publisher, sealed it away. At the time my father got it, he sold it within a week for $750. At the exact same time, another book dealer in the Boston area had the same book, Mosquitoes Faulkner, first edition, but it didn't have the paper jacket, had a few tiny little nicks and bumps on it, nothing terrible. It took them a year to sell it at $40. Because a lot of collecting is prestige. It's maybe to say, look what I've got. I've got the best. I've got the most wonderful. Essentially, I've got what you don't have. And people who can afford it will pay absolute top dollar for the very, very best, but might not consider spending anything at all for something slightly less. Other things that can affect the value, signed by the author. Well, once again, if the author's unknown, unheard of, the fact that it's signed might not mean that much. Maybe one of your relatives wrote a book of poetry, had 50 copies, signed it, gave it to family members. It might mean an awful lot to your family, but it doesn't add that much to the price. On the other hand, if it's signed by someone famous, maybe Ernest Hemingway, that could add hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to the value. In almost any type of collecting that you get into, there are nuances They can add or subtract to the value, and I use signed books to show that off. There are some authors that are almost impossible to get their signature. J.D. Salinger, for instance, who wrote Catcher in the Rye. He was reclusive. He lived up in New Hampshire. He, other than to a close personal friend, would not sign a book. His signature adds thousands of dollars to the value because you just can't get them. Matter of fact, a little aside, every once in a while, someone will ask me, is there something that came in the store that you saw that you would have loved to have had, but you couldn't get? It's sort of like the fish that got away. One time a man came in and he had 10 letters of J.D. Salinger. He was a friend of Salinger, and they were valuable. But there was one letter that I particularly liked. Salinger was relating to him about when he first moved to New Hampshire. He was looking back on it and talking about when his house was built. And he was saying, when they built the foundation of the house, there was a whole bunch of high school kids who worked on the foundation. And then he sort of said, well, one of those kids turned out to be a pretty good athlete, that kid, Carlton Fisk. So Carlton Fisk helped build J.D. Salinger's house. I personally think maybe that letter belongs in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Maybe someday I'll hear about it again, but as far as I know, it's still out there somewhere. There are also some authors that sign a lot of their books. There was a local author that maybe some of you who are listening knew or have his books, wrote wonderful ghost, sea, buried treasure, pirate stories of the New England coast, Edward Rose Snow. Now, Snow was a friend of my father's and we knew him. And I remember one day he came into the store and he told us he had just been on Cape Cod and he'd gone into a bookstore that he had never been in before. And Snow said he went right up to the section where his books were, pulled one off the shelf, opened it up and exclaimed, "My, a rare, unsigned copy." And then he took out his pen and signed it. And then he went and introduced himself to the owner of the store. So books signed by Edward Rose Snow don't add as much to the value. My father one time had a copy of F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic, The Great Gatsby. Now, just opposite what I was saying before, it was a first edition, but it didn't have the jacket. It was well worn and read. But when you opened it up, it was inscribed to the greatest living poet, T.S. Eliot, sincerely, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, in addition to that inscription, when T.S. Eliot read it, he made marginal notes, annotations, comments, crossed things out, added things into just about every page of the book. That book now would be worth $200,000, $300,000, maybe even $400,000 because of the association. One last story about signed books. There was an autograph and manuscript dealer in Massachusetts who was actually at the time one of the most prominent in the world. But when he was a young boy, he used to collect books by Robert Frost. And he knew Robert Frost. And he went to London when he was about 13 years old and he bought a copy of Frost's first book called A Boy's Will. Very complicated, what is a first edition, paid a lot of money for it at the time, came back to the New England area, and a couple of weeks later, he was meeting with Frost and he had the book and he said, "Look what I've got." And Frost looked at it and said, "Well, what did you pay for it?" And he told him. Frost said, "Give me the book." Frost opened it up and the front two end papers wrote a 2-page description of how to tell the first binding from the second binding, from the third binding, from the fourth, how they change bindings, why they change bindings, the different colors of the bindings, on and on and on for 2 pages, signed it, closed the book, handed it back to the boy and said, "Now it's worth what you paid for it." In any case, let me digress a little, give you a little bit of my background and the history of the store. The history of the Brattle Bookshop goes back to the 1820s, but for all practical purposes, it was going out of business in 1949. My father was getting married. My mother had $500. With that, they bought half interest in the store. And it's always been in Boston. People call us on Brattle Street and Harvard Square saying, "Where are you?" We tell them we're downtown. When my parents first bought the store, there was a little side street in what was then Scully Square. To make it even more confusing, the street doesn't even exist anymore. It's where Boston City Hall Plaza is now. And my father built the store with his great love of books, his hard work, his knowledge. And he was a bit of a character and a showman. And they slowly but surely built the business up. And we've had 7 different locations over the years, mainly due to urban renewal. But every time we'd move the store, or my father would move it, he'd move the best books to the new location, then he'd run sales. Half price, $1.50, quarter dime. Last day of the sale, though, everything was free. And he would literally have hundreds of people line up with bags, packs, satchels, whatever. He'd ring a big bell. People would go charging into the store, grab whatever they could grab. He'd ring the bell again. That group would leave. The next group would come in. And he gave away over 250,000 books that way. Now, the last time he was doing this was in 1969. He was moving from the end of Washington Street near Boston City Hall to West Street, where we are now. And at the end of the giveaway, there was a bunch of books left over. And like I said, my father was a bit of a character and a showman. If you can sort of picture this, he hired a covered wagon with a cowboy and a horse team. And on the cover of the covered wagon, it said, "Go West, book lovers, go 5 West Street, Brattle Bookshop." They filled it up with books and they drove it from the end of Washington Street near City Hall, up Court Street, down Tremont by the Boston Common to where West Street is, then back down Washington Street with my father sitting in back, throwing books out the whole way. Now, the superintendent in charge of traffic was a friend of his, told him he could do it all morning, but within an hour, the city was in an absolute standstill. They told him to stop. He had gotten his point across. He didn't care. And we've been on West Street since then. When we first moved in, we were in a 5-story, 150-year-old wooden building, absolutely crammed full of books. In February of 1980, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning that the building was on fire, and it literally burnt to the ground. I mean, it was 100% gone. But we wanted to continue to keep going, not go out of business. We found a storefront a few doors up the street. Within a month, we reopened. We had folding tables. People either sold, gave us, donated books. Kevin White, who was the mayor at the time, came down with a carload of books. And even though it was a meager stock, the main thing was just keep going, continue. Over the next 4 years, we slowly but surely rebuilt the stock. 4 years after that, we bought the building we're in now, which is, again, just a few doors down on West Street. And it's sort of the old Dickensian type of store. Outside stands at $1, 3 and 5, 2 floors of general used books, and then a 3rd floor with rare books, autographs, manuscripts, leather bindings, and so on. In that type of business, the large, old, general secondhand bookstore is a dying business, especially in the cities. And the reason for that, people still like to buy, sell, read books, but in the cities, property value has gone so high, that rent has gone so high, that old bookstores, which I can assure you are not the most valuable business and the most efficient businesses in the world, one right after the other have been going out of business. And in the last few years, the internet has just speeded that process along. And needless to say, the last year has even made that more challenging. But we're going to be here, no question about it. And I've been doing this all my life. My parents say my first word was book. I really don't know. Maybe it was. I'm sure they were talking about them all the time. And I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. I have a degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. I was going to get a doctoral degree at the University of Wisconsin. But in 1973, I needed a year off. My father's health wasn't that good. That year off now has been over 40 years, and I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere. If you were to ask me, what's one item I wish I could find, I'll hold this up, but it's a little pamphlet here called Tamerlane by a Bostonian, done in 1827. It doesn't look like much, it's just a little pamphlet, but the Bostonian who did this was Edgar Allan Poe. This is his first book. and it's a classic rarity in American literature. Matter of fact, the first copy to ever really be found was in the 1890s on a dealer's 10-cent table. Another dealer spotted it there, bought a stack of books with it so it wouldn't stand out, and in 1890 sold it for $1,000. Then in the 1950s, there were two postmen in the New Bedford area who on the side were book scouts, and being postmen, they knew where all the yard sales were. They bought a trunk of books. Bottom of the trunk was a Tamerlane. Families got involved. They got to negotiating. After 6 months, they sold it for $10,000. Now, I don't know if it was worth it because they started out best of friends. By the time they sold it, they never spoke again, but they got their $10,000. And then about 20 years ago, a Newburyport antique dealer died. Whole estate was auctioned, paintings, prints, antiques, furniture, books as a group, $600 to an antique dealer in New Hampshire. They took all the pamphlets, put them in a box, $15 each. Someone, of course, picked out a Tamerlane. 20 years ago, sold it for $198,000. And one recently sold for $800,000. And let me just say, this is a facsimile. A lot of what I show off are originals. I don't have million-dollar pamphlets to just wave around. But if any of you want to take a close look, check your screens, upstairs and downstairs in your attics, basement, cellars. If you have one, please give me a call. I'd love to hear about it. A lot of the fun of collecting is learning about something, is studying, it's appreciating it. It's really your knowledge that makes something interesting and thus valuable. Someone might look at something and say, oh, that's a scrap of paper. Someone else might say, that's a broadside that led to the Boston Tea Party, that led to the American Revolution, that led to our country's independence. So it's really that knowledge and understanding that makes something interesting and thus valuable. Now, the next item I have here, and this is an original, it's hard to hold up, but let me assure you, it's a letter. It's on White House stationery. It's dated April 11th, 1933. And on the surface, this is interesting, but the story behind it is even more. It starts, Dear Jim, I want to send you this note to tell you how happy I am that you are to represent the United States in Poland. It's a most important post, et cetera, signed always sincerely, Franklin Roosevelt. And it's to the Honorable James Michael Curley, Mayor of Boston. Now, on the surface, this seems like a great honor. It's an ambassadorial appointment. Well, Curley didn't think it was such an honor. Matter of fact, I think he thought Roosevelt was trying to get rid of him, which of course he probably was. And Curley's response to Roosevelt was, remember, this was 1933. He said, in Poland, with Germany on one side, Russia on the other, you should send your worst Republican enemy to Poland. He said, matter of fact, if you think it's so important, why don't you quit and go there yourself? Now, Curley's feelings for Washington didn't change over the years. We also have 10 letters that he wrote to his wife when he was in Danbury prison. Now, even though these were personal letters, he was still very much the politician. And there was one quote I particularly liked. He had just gotten into prison and he wrote to his wife and he said, many of the four-legged creatures in my cell have more honor than the two-legged creatures in Washington. In any case, enough for Curley. Not everything I have are books, but we get in a lot of ephemera, pamphlets. Here's a program from the 1912 World Series. The Red Sox won the World Series in 1912, won a few more times in the teens, and then we had to wait an awfully long time. Hopefully we don't have to do that again. But not only is it interesting as a baseball item, but on the back, there's an ad for Arrow shirts and collars. Collars are $2 for $1, shirts are $1.50 and $2. I don't think you'll get them for that nowadays. It's also become very popular. Well, up until last year, it was very popular to go on cruises and cruise ships. I mean, Did I have a brochure here for a ship? Tells you a wonderfully built where to book passage, and anyone who wants to go on the Titanic. Now, probably a cruise ship would hate me saying this right now, but I don't know which would be more safe, going on the Titanic or going on a cruise ship at this moment. But this is an original brochure from the Titanic, tells you where to book passage, and almost anything you can think of, there are people out there who are interested. There are whole societies of Titanic historians who do nothing but study the Titanic. There's a tendency when you talk about items and collectible, and when I do Antiques Roadshow, which is a great show, keep watching it. Hopefully we'll get out on the road and doing more of them next year. But everything seems to be worth thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. And I like to point out, not everything has to be high priced to be fun. Old Life magazines, for instance. Here's one with Errol Flynn on the cover. Another was Elizabeth Taylor when she was 15 years old. And the large majority of these just sell for a few dollars. There are a few exceptions. There are some that go higher, but the large majority are relatively cheap. But people love them. We used to have a wall by a stairway at the store with a few hundred of the more famous Life magazines. People would stop and stare at that wall, sometimes for half an hour at the time, just lost in thought and memory. They loved them for the stories, the articles, the photographs, made wonderful birthday or anniversary presents if you fell on the right date. But there was a man who came in, a regular customer. He came in and he bought about 50 Life magazines from World War II. And I said to him, that wasn't what he normally bought. So I said to him, why are you buying these? And he said, well, I want to teach my children about World War II. And he thought a nice way to do it would be to get some of the old Lives, look at a few of the photographs, and maybe read an article or two and then discuss it with them. It actually sounded like a good idea to me, but I was skeptical. He came in a few weeks later and I said to him, how's it going with the Lives? He said, fabulously, but not the way I thought. He says the kids don't care about the stories, the articles, the photographs, but they love the ads. And he says, and it turns out by looking at and discussing the ads with them, I can probably teach them more about what the United States was like during World War II than if we read and looked at everything else. I have a lot of other things here. I have a cookbook from the 1700s. Some of the recipes are wonderful, but then how to bake eels the common way, I don't know if I want to bake them anyway. One of the most interesting parts about the business for me is going out to houses and estates. That's how we get most of our books. It's almost like being Jim Hawkins on Treasure Island. Every day, never knowing who you're going to meet, what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters. And I'll relate a few of those stories. And then after that, maybe we can do some question and answer and maybe a couple of appraisals. In any case, I was out of the store and I got back and there was a message that Mrs. Fisher had called and she had some books. I called her up and she said, oh, my father just died in Providence. He has 500 art reference books. We want to call a number of dealers in to get an offer on them. Would you be interested in going? And basically, Providence is only an hour away. We go all over the Northeast, everywhere. So that's relatively close. They lived on an old street called Benefit Street up near Brown University. I got to the house. It was a large old colonial house. I got led through the house into a courtyard, into a garage. Second floor of the garage, they had 5,000 books, not 500. Well, it turned out her married name was Fisher. Her father's name was John Nicholas Brown. Family founded Brown University, one of the wealthier families in the country. And after 6 months, I bought about 80% of the books I wanted. I was pleased. She was happy. And she said, my mother has a lot of books. Most are being given to the university. Some are being sold at auction. But would you like to go to Newport to take a look at the books there? Now, their house in Newport was one of the mansions on the ocean. I mentioned this to my wife. She decided to come with me on this deal. And one of the fascinating parts about it was being in one of those houses that was still being lived in by a family. And at one point, wandering from the basement to the attic, all on my own, with no tour guide, no one saying, go, come here, go here, don't touch this, but just wandering through the whole place. It was fascinating. Another time I got called to Newport to do an appraisal. Now, when I usually do talks, I do hundreds of free appraisals. We still do them online. And if people want to ever contact us, we always phone, online, pictures, letters. But there are times, and we tried, our goal is that whenever you think of an old book, that you think of the Brattle Bookshop. I don't care if you think of 10 others, as long as we're one of the 10. One of the ways we feel we can do that is giving out as much free information as reasonable. But there are times when we talk about paid appraisals for insurance, estate taxes, and so on, and then we discuss the fee. But another mansion in Newport, not quite as big as the Browns. This was the Perry family, Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry. And what they had was a whole stack of papers from the War of 1812. During the war, their family were privateers. Well, they're privateers if you're on our side. They're pirates if you're on the other side. It's all the way you look at it. But these were the day-to-day accountings of the ships. They were fascinating to read through. They would sometimes capture a ship and realize tens of thousands of dollars profit. In 1812, that was an incredible amount of money. Then one day, one of the ships got into a battle. The ship got hit. The captain got hit. He lost his leg. 3 days later, there was a tiny entry at the bottom of a page, and it said, Captain, $5 bonus, loss of leg. And that was the last you heard of the captain. So that's a little different nowadays, too. When my father was still alive, and he died over 35 years ago, we got a call from a lady. She was very vague about her name, who she was, what she had, but she sounded like she might have a few interesting things. She lived in Sharon, so it was fairly close. We got to her house. It was a little ranch house. Paint was peeling, weeds were growing, and you sort of say, oh, gee, what's going to be here? She answered the door. She was quite elderly. We walk in, and there are just gorgeous antiques everywhere. I mean, really, really beautiful antiques. And she got to talking. It turned out she was originally from the Boston area, but she had married the Prince of the Ukraine, the cousin of the Tsar of Russia. He had escaped just before the revolution. And she told story after story about being Russian nobility in Europe and all the court intrigues and all the goings on, how T.E. Shaw used to stay at their house all the time, how she didn't think he accidentally died on a motorcycle, but there was a lot more to it. T. Shaw, of course, was Lawrence of Arabia. And she went on and on and on with these wonderful stories. Turned out her books were lousy, but the stories were absolutely wonderful. As a matter of fact, when we first got into the house, on a wall, she had 10 watercolors. They were sort of pastoral European scenes. And when I first saw them, I thought they were nice. And the more she talked and the more I looked at them and the nicer I thought they were. And I finally said to her, those 10 watercolors, they're really nice. And she sort of turned around and said, oh, yes, they're all Turners. So she had 10 original Turner watercolors, probably $1 million worth of paintings. And it was like, oh, yes, they're all Turner. So you never know what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters. And matter of fact, speaking of characters, about 20 years ago, we went to one of our customers' 100th birthday parties. Now, when you go to a man's 100th birthday party, and he tells you he just got back from Barcelona, he's going to give a talk in Florida, and he's been asked to lecture in Tokyo. And I finally said to him, wait a minute, you're 100 years old. Don't you think Tokyo's an awfully long way to go? And he said, well, when I used to work, it took me well over 25 hours to get to Chicago. He says, I don't think Tokyo is a whole lot further than that nowadays. And here's a man who could one day tell you about sitting down to dinner with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. He was obviously a much younger man at the time. He said he was excited about this talk and all the learning and insight he was going to get from these men. Said he got to the table a little bit early. About 5 minutes later, Ford came in and sat down next to him. And about 15 minutes later, Edison came in. Now, Edison was elderly. He had one of those big horns for hearing and sat down opposite them. And he said the first thing Ford turned to Edison and yelled, "My Tom, you look very good." And Edison turned to Ford and yelled, "It's the Carter's little liver pills." This man said all night long, all they did was yell about Carter's little liver pills. And he said next time he wanted to learn something, he went to the library. I can go on and on and on with these stories. So I'll tell one more, and then maybe we can see if there are any questions or appraisals, or I can keep going. We get hundreds of phone calls at the store, people wanting to know, do you have a book? Can you get the book? How hard is it to get the book? What's the value of the book? Does the book exist? And most of those questions, either I or the people I work with, we can answer right off the top of our head. Some are a little more involved, and occasionally you really have to do some research, but that can be fun too. But every once in a while, you get a call that really stands out. Again, this was a while ago, but I answered the phone. "Hello, Brattle Bookshop, can I help you?" Lady, elderly, thick Irish brogue. And the first thing she says is, "President Kennedy slept with me." Now, I have to admit that gets your attention. And she stopped and waited for it to sink in. And then she went on to explain that she had worked for the Kennedy family and she had been his nursemaid. And when he was 2 and 3 years old, he used to fall asleep in her arms. So he did sleep with her, but maybe not what you first think. And what she had was a whole series of handwritten letters from the president. Now, presidential letters of any type have value. Handwritten letters from later 20th century presidents are very hard to get, scarce, and valuable. She wanted to get an offer on them. I was actually skeptical about that, but I thought she'd be fun to meet, so I went to her house. She was great. The wonderful stories. The letters were fabulous. I gave her what I thought was a tremendous offer on them, but much as I suspected, there was no way she could sell these letters. They were part of her life. I left a note behind. As far as I know, her family still has them, probably where they belong. Again, maybe someday I'll hear about them, but I can go on. Now, one thing I will mention, I'll give a little plug. I do a podcast called Brattlecast. I've done about 75 of them. I do a new one every 2 weeks. If you like the stories I've been telling, listen to Brattlecast. They're 15, 20 minutes long. But if anybody has any questions, if there are any, if there are any books you want me to praise, I'll do that. I know I already have one that was emailed in ahead of time. And if not, I'll tell a few more stories and we'll go from there. Are there any questions up there or no? Or put them in on the chat and we can talk with them from there.
Okay, we have a question from Edward. I'm going to let him talk.
Edward, are you there?
I think there he is.
I am here. Thank you, Ken.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
My question, I guess, I firmly believe you should collect what you enjoy, and you'll be happy if you do that. But with all your experience, have you seen, from a value perspective, have you seen authors or types of books sort of rise and lower in value like stocks over the last 30, 40 years? Have you seen authors sort of be in favor and go out of favor and that sort of thing?
I've seen a lot of that. One of the things, whenever anyone asks me about, gee, what would be a good thing to collect? What would be for the future, that might go up in value and so on. First of all, I'll give the line you just gave: collect what you like, have fun with it, enjoy it. A lot of the fun of collecting is the hunt and the search and meeting other people who have the same interest. And that's probably the most important part. But I say, if you're looking for being able to predict the future, I'll say, if you can predict the future, lottery tickets would be a whole lot better investment. But as far as seeing things go up and down, actually, yes, definitely we have. There are some authors that become very popular, that the prices go up. Stephen King has gone way up in value, but then it's moderated a little. There are some subjects that have gone up in value. And it's an interesting thing. What I tell people a lot, and this is true of antiques, and a lot of this is a reflection of the internet. There are a lot of things that were very valuable or hard to collect rare, especially through the 70s, 80s, 90s, even up to 2000, that people would pay a lot of money for. And they actually weren't rare. They were just hard to get. They were inefficient to find. So if you went into a bookstore and you saw it on the shelf and you thought it was high, you'd still say, wait a minute, maybe I'm going to need this and want it. And when I need it, I'm not going to be able to get it. And you'd pay that price and have it in your big library, and so that it would be right there where you could get it. Now, though, with the internet, you look for that book and you go click, click, 25, 35, 40 copies of it show up, and two things happen. First of all, you realize there are a lot out there. You realize the price might vary tremendously, but if they're all about the same condition, you're going to buy the cheapest one. So the prices have come down. The other thing that's happened, though, at that point, rather than saying, wait a minute, I might need this from 2 years from now and I better buy it now, you'll say, wait a minute, there's a lot of them out there. I'll buy it when I need it, which probably means you'll never buy it. So that's happened. Also, there are a lot of books that when I first came into work with my father that were used books. And then they became sort of interested, people became more and more interested, and they became collectible, and the price went up. And then the internet came along, and now they use books again. So the price went up and down. And that also happens sometimes when a movie comes out, the price will go way up and then it will moderate. Or something happens in the news, the price goes up and moderates. Or just for one reason or another, an author was popular. Generationally, we've seen this a lot. Quite honestly, people like Hemingway, Faulkner, a lot of those authors hit a peak about 10 or 15 years ago and now are going down a little because the people who collected them were the ones who grew up reading Hemingway, Faulkner, and the next generation maybe grew up reading another author. Maybe they read Joseph Heller, Catch-22, or maybe Harper Lee. And so those have gone up. And my guess is when they get a little older, maybe you'll see the next generation collecting a little bit different. There used to be a man who came into, I know I'm giving a long answer, but there used to be a man when he came into the store and he used to collect books by Horatio Alger. And this was a die-hard collector. I mean, he wanted everything and anything of Horatio Alger. My father once was doing a midnight radio show, and my father mentioned that he had just gotten in some Horatio Alger books. When he drove home at 1 a.m, who was sitting in his car waiting for my father to get home? This man, because he grew up on the Horatio Alger, Strive and Grow Rich. People now don't even know who Horatio Alger is, don't particularly collect the same things, or they collected the Tom Swift books, whereas maybe my generation grew up on the Hardy Boys or the Bobbsey Twins or the Carolyn Keene, Nancy Drew. So that always changes too. So it does go up and down, but stay with the first advice. Collect what you enjoy, have fun going out, search, find, meet people. That's probably the real joy of collecting. Long answer, but I think that sort of covers that one.
Okay. We do have a question from one of our attendees named Joe. He says that in the late 1970s, he worked at a Boston bookstore and bought a very large book called The Golden Age of Tarzan by Bern Hogarth. He said it is signed and numbered. He's interested in selling it. And he wants to know if you would have any idea what the value of that would be today.
It's a very large book about Tarzan, and it's still collectible to a point. It would probably, it's one of those books that if you said to me, go out and find a copy of this book, you'd probably pay up $100, $200 for it. But the interest in Tarzan is dropping off too. The first editions are not quite as asked for. They're not as politically correct, to say the least. The movies aren't there. So the trend in Tarzan has been a little bit down, but that specific book, if you said to me, find me a copy, go out and get it, it would be in that range. On the other hand, if I had one in the store, I would probably price it in that range, but whereas 20 years ago, it might have sold in a week or a month or two, 6 months, a year, I might still have it. So it's slowed down a little. And maybe next, let me do one that the Historical Society, sent in about one of their books on Bridgewater. It was a book done in the 1840s by Mitchell on the history and early settlement of Bridgewater. Very nice book. In an average copy of a book like that, if you had to get a nice copy, again, you probably have to pay $100, $200. The prices of those kind of books, the town histories, have been trending again downwards. And part of the reason they've been trending downwards, not because they're not just as good, but there are two types of people who buy that type of book. One is the person who just needs the information. Maybe they're looking up their history. Maybe they're looking the family history. Maybe they're looking up the history of the area and they live, near and they need Bridgewater and so on. Those people don't find the necessity of having the book as much because a lot of the information is online. The other type of person who wants the book is someone who lives in Bridgewater, their family's from Bridgewater. They want a copy of the book because they like seeing it on the shelves, they like having it. Maybe they live in Bridgewater, or maybe a friend of theirs is moving to the area and it makes a nice housewarming present. But that cuts down the number of people looking, and if you cut down the demand, then the prices are going up. But still, it's $100, $200 book. But this is particularly special because a later historian of Bridgewater added, changed, corrected, added lots of notes, pictures. And then what they did is then they added all that into the book, had it rebound with all of this information in it, all handwritten and done out. And that makes that particular copy should be in the Historical Society. And I'm sure future historians can mine that information for either future books, future articles, future histories. But again, how much demand is there? And probably the major demand would be a Historical Society, which I'll bet you if you talk to the people at the Historical Society, they tell you they're not rich. They tell you they don't have a huge supply. But I would guess that if a book like that came out nowadays, $500, maybe $1,000, and especially if there were a couple of donors who said, look, we'll pay for this. We want it in the Historical Society, and somewhere in that ballpark. One thing though, since it is already in the Historical Society.
And while you're talking, I'm going to go ahead and show, I'm going to show our speakers, our attendees, some pictures of the book so that they can get it.
And one of the things I'll continue, and when you look at this picture, that's about twice as thick as the normal book would be.
Yes.
And what makes this one really valuable is all the handwritten information in it, all the pictures added, all of the extra information. One of the things that I would strongly, strongly advise, if you haven't already done it at the Historical Society, is make a digital copy, even if it's just taking out your camera and photographing each copy, because the book itself, you can get that information, the printed book. But all of the extra information in there, if this was somehow to be lost, to be misplaced, nice way of saying maybe stolen, Or if there was a disaster at the where the house where it's stored, it would be a tremendous loss to the history. So one of my first suggestions always is, you've obviously photographed a lot of it. I don't know if you've done it all, but then also have a copy of that either on the web or on a disk, or, well, no one uses disks anymore, but on a flash drive or something that isn't close to where the actual book is. So there are copies out there of it. And you know, but that's what I would find fascinating, is reading through the original book and then reading through the changes or the corrections or the ideas, and just seeing, and it would be fascinating if someone then read through it again and updated, changed, corrected, and did it again, you know, 100-something years later. It would be fun. So anyways, that's that book. I think historically it's priceless. Probably if you had to say, gee, if this came on the market, probably $500, $1,000 would be a fair price.
Okay. I do have some photos that were just sent to me by one of our attendees. She wasn't able to join us via video. So she sent some pictures. I'm going to share those now and ask her to talk about them with us. I don't know if I can. Lisa, are you there?
Well, this is one, is she, no?
I don't know. I don't know since she's.
There it is. Okay, Dickens, Oliver Twist, American Notes. I don't, it's obviously the leather binding, but it's dried out and cracked a lot. Also, just looking at that from what is in the book, I know it's not a first edition. First of all, Oliver Twist, when it first came out, was in 3 volumes. American Notes was in 2 volumes, but they weren't the same size. In other words, Oliver Twist was taller than American Notes. And if you saw the 2 next to each other, it seems, so Dickens was one of the most popular authors of the 19th century in English. And there are hundreds of different editions of Dickens that have come out over the years. And there are many, many leather-bound copies. There are many cloth copies, many, many of them. This, without seeing the title page, looks like one of the general leather-bound. Oh, Estes and Laureate. I can't quite see the corner, but Estes and Laureate. What Estes and Laureate did.
There we go.
And that's in the 1880s. Dickens died in 1870. So you know that that's a later edition. But what Estes and Laureate was famous for was they were a great bookstore in downtown Boston, and they serviced what you would call the carriage trade. And when in the Industrial Revolution, large numbers of people were building larger houses, maybe through the Back Bay, maybe out as the railroads went out into Newton and some of the suburbs, they'd have larger houses, they'd have a library in the house. But if you have a library in the house, you have to fill the shelves. And a company like Laureate's would sell the leather-bound sets like of Thackeray, of Dickens, of Thoreau, of Emerson, of Mark Twain, of Sir Walter Scott. And they would have these beautiful sets. And it was almost more like a decorating job as much as it was a literary job. And they put out huge numbers of these in beautiful, beautiful leather. They still go for a good price because we still get people in who decorate with beautiful books. They're basically furniture. But once there's one little chip, wear, crack, or whatever, that whole value drops out. From what I saw of the picture, I hate to say this, but if it has sentimental value, that's the value. If it doesn't have sentimental value, you're talking literally $1, $3, $5, maybe not much more because of the condition.
She does say that she has a total of 15 different volumes of Dickens.
Well, then add if it's $1 each, then it's 15. If it's a couple of dollars each, it's 30. But the fact that it's complete, incomplete doesn't make any difference because the condition is so poor that someone might pay a few dollars just because it's old, but nobody who's a collector wants to buy it. And quite honestly, if you just want to read it, first of all, you can get it free online, or you can go to Barnes and Noble and get a paperback, or you can come here and for a few dollars get a nice copy just to read.
Okay.
Why don't, since we're getting a little bit close, why don't I take a couple of more questions? I'll end on another story or two. And if there are a couple of more, otherwise I'll end on another story or two.
I don't see anybody with their hands up. Or
Okay, then why don't we let that go? I will say, oh, wait a minute, I see Mary.
oh, let's get Mary. Mary, you're muted.
You're muted.
Here I am.
Okay,
I have a book. I think it's a Christmas book called Yuletide Stories by Ella Farman, 1884. And it is like that.
okay, I see it, yeah.
Have you seen this before?
Yeah.
A book like this?
There are hundreds and hundreds of Christmas books.
Okay.
And I couldn't quite see the condition on it, but that's sort of a typical cloth binding, which people like. It's probably something that would sell in the $25, $50 range. Christmas always sells, not Victorian books on Christmas, but in that range. If it had color plates, it would go a little bit better. Those look black and white, at least what I saw.
Black and white, yes.
$25,
Now,
$50 is probably that.
What about old almanacs, which are very colorful? This one is from 1876.
And it's a guide to health. So they're health almanacs, probably
Guide
$10 or so. Almanacs, where they really get valuable is if they're on specific subjects like anti-slavery, going back to the Revolution. Obviously, you have Poor Richard's Almanac with Benjamin Franklin. If you get into the very earliest 1830s of Benjamin Franklin's original Poor Richard's, you can literally get into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But most almanacs, like Farmer's Almanac and those, they're a few dollars. They're fascinating and fun, but there are a lot of them around. And unless there's some real specialty, they don't get up high.
Okay, one more, and then I'll
Sure.
stop. This is a children's book called Great A, Little A, and Bouncing Bee, Their Adventures. Have you seen this one before?
Yeah, and probably
Okay.
$10 to $25. They're just nice, well, but they're nice children's books.
Nice
You know,
pictures.
and one of the things is, when I say that things are a couple of dollars, $5, $10, if you have 500 books at home, that can add up too. So it's not always just the one thing.
Mhm.
I'll end with a couple of quick stories. I do Antiques Roadshow. That's a lot of fun to do. I hope everybody watches it. Obviously, last year they couldn't go out and tape, although they did a few at some celebrities that I think are coming up in May. Love to get out on it. Hopefully next fall we'll be able to, if the virus settles down and the vaccine. But it's a lot of fun, and so I just encourage people to do that. And I'll tell you, anywhere you go in this country, it's beautiful and the people are friendly. Don't talk about politics and religion, but if you make any effort at all, that's one of the great things about the show, is why would I go to Boise or Fargo or many of the cities I've been to? But it's just wonderful. The people are great. The show is wonderful. 3,000 to 4,000 people come with a couple of thousand items. You appraise all day long, and hopefully something comes in that you can pitch to a producer that they tape and do on TV. But I'll end with one last story about books. I will emphasize that if anybody has any questions, appraisals, things, one of the things that you can always email, call, phone, write. And one of the problems is when you ask somebody who enjoys what they do a question, it's not getting an answer. It's getting them to stop answering. And I love what I do, so I encourage it. But one last story about appraisals. I got called a number of years ago to a large old church in Boston, well over 100-year-old church. And they wanted me, they had a huge library, but they wanted to just see if over the years they'd accumulated any valuable books. And I spent a day there, and they actually had some good books. It was fun. But at the end of the day, the priest said to me, could you come down the basement? There were a few more books. Went down the basement, looked at those books. And then there was what I call a closet, but it was more like a small room. And the priest opened the door, front to back, floor to ceiling, top to bottom. It was stuffed with thousands of old Bibles. And I looked at the priest and I said, what is this? And he says, well, people hate to throw away a book. They feel it's sacrilegious to throw away a Bible. So what happens when a parishioner dies and the family doesn't want the Bible? They come to the church and they present it to the church. And he says, what do? We don't want to offend anybody. We graciously accept it. Then we go downstairs, open the door, put it in with the rest of them. And he says, and we can't drive a dumpster up to the back of the church and fill it full of Bibles. That just wouldn't be right. But I use it as an example to say that if you want to donate something to a charity, ask them if they want it first. If they want it and can use it, it's fabulous. But if all you're doing is taking your old junk, and you're really not doing anybody a favor. So let me just end on that note. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully, maybe 6 months, a year or so from now, we'll able to do this live. I love Zoom, it works, but if I never did another Zoom lecture, I'd be happy, because I'd like to be getting out, actually seeing people, actually being able to touch the books, do the appraisals. But thank you for having me tonight in any case.
Well, Ken, before you go, we do have a few more questions.
Okay, I'll do a couple more questions. One of the things I will point out to people, my wife says, people say to me, gee, are you looking to retire and so on? And my wife says, well, yeah, he only works half a day, 12 hours. I get to work at 5:30 in the morning and the store closes at 5:30 in the afternoon. So I do work half a day, 12 hours. And when I do these, I do extra, but I love doing it. Anyways, go on with the questions. Let's see.
You had mentioned Bibles, and I had been told by somebody that most of the Bibles printed like in the late 18th and the 19th, well, I should say 18th centuries and 19th centuries are usually more valuable for any genealogical data stored in them than the book itself is valuable. Would you say that that's your understanding?
I would say that that is probably true. When you're appraising, the most common book of all time, most commonly printed book of all time, is the Bible. And in most cases, when people come in with a Bible, and especially if it's one of these old family Bibles with the beautiful leather, beautiful clasp, in that case, they can run $100, $200, $300 because they make wonderful gifts, but break one clasp, have one hinge go, and they lose almost all of that value. And so the book might be sentimentally priceless. Monetarily, on the other hand, it probably doesn't have a lot of value. Now, at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned the Gutenberg Bible, where it would sell for millions and millions of dollars, and one page would sell for $50,000 or $100,000. So it's always worth checking. You never, there can be reasons, but it's interesting. I recently had a historical society call me, and they had someone with a Bible, with a fairly famous person. I won't say who this historical society is, but they say they have stopped, and it's a major historical society, they stopped collecting or having Bibles at all, unless the Bible had a lot of handwritten information. So what they had suggested was that this Bible go to another historical site in Boston. Now, the fact that this was Paul Revere's Bible and he had written his name in it One historical society said, we don't want Bibles because they take up a lot of room, and just a signed Bible doesn't add a lot. So this one ended up at the Paul Revere House in Boston. So that means a lot to them, and it's worth a lot of money. But historically, yes, a lot of the Bibles, they are more genealogical, and if they have that page in them with the family births, deaths, marriages. Now, I don't know what the Bridgewater Historical Society, but a lot of them I've found will say, yes, we want to Xerox out that page. We want to copy out a photograph, the title page with it, but we don't want the whole Bible. Now, and a lot of times it's just a space issue and a taking care of it issue. So the valuable information might be that page in the middle, maybe if there are photographs, maybe the title page, but the whole big, huge Bible, boy, you could fill a building with those. So yes,
And
he's
the last-
right. And it's always worth checking though.
The last question I have is, we have a person who has a family estate with several books that they want to know are sellable. She wants to know if our attendees can reach out to you privately to set up a time to review.
Boy, that sounds like a question that I'd say, I hope somebody asks. Absolutely. I mean, our business is buying and selling books. And even within this time of COVID, we still go out to houses almost every day. And when people call us, it's interesting. The first question that we ask is, how many books do you have? And are there any particular types? And very common, the answer is we have a lot of books and they're fiction and nonfiction, which is everything. But nowadays, actually, technology has made some of those questions really easy. Behind me, you'll see books. Well, if somebody were to have a digital camera and take a picture of a shelf at a time, or sometimes even two shelves at a time, if those pictures are in focus and we can read the spine, so read just what's on the spine, that gives us a huge, I mean, we can tell what a lot of those books are. So a lot of times if someone says we have a library or collection, the first thing we'll say to people is, if you can do it, take some digital pictures, make sure they're in focus, that's important, and put a phone number in. We always answer within 2 business days. And if there are other questions to ask, at least it's a starting point. Now, if this person said they have a handful of books, they can always call. It would help if they write down what they are, because on a phone call, it's just quicker if you can quickly read it off. But we can give you an idea. And absolutely, that's what our business is taught. And all day long, we have people calling in, what's this worth? What's that worth? I do radio shows. I've been on with Dan Ray and people on the radio talking to people, and on the phone, I can do most of it. But yeah, absolutely. And for me, that's the real fun. That's what's coming in next. And every once in a while, somebody will come in with something or say something, and it's like, can I get there before they hang up the phone? And other times it's like, well, maybe. But so absolutely get in touch, call if you have questions, or go to our webpage. We have loads of information about that. But again, we love talking about books. So call, ask, and I'm very good about returning calls.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining the Old Bridgewater Historical Society tonight. Mr. Gloss has graciously allowed us to record the video and given us permission to post it on our website. So that'll be up by the end of the week. So anybody that wants to go back and review some of his great information can do so. We thank you again. It's been a very entertaining lecture, and we hope to have you back in the, not so distant pandemic-less future.
I'm looking forward to this and going to a Red Sox game and holding my grandson. So yes, we all want that, and I would absolutely love it and look forward to it. Thank you.
Everybody have a great night. Thanks for joining us.